They say still waters run deep, that beneath the most placid surface, secrets can lie buried in the cold, silent dark. For most, a lakeside home is a dream, a place of peaceful mornings and quiet evenings. But what happens when that dream becomes a watery grave? What happens when the person who vowed to protect you is the one who puts you there? Tonight, we're not just telling a story. We're bearing witness to the chilling end of one. A tale of a perfect marriage, a perfect plan, and the perfect husband who became a cold-blooded killer. But before we break the surface of this truly chilling case, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. It's the best way to ensure you don't miss a single investigation into the darkness that hides just beneath the surface. Now take a breath. The dive team is ready, and what they're about to find will change everything. The cold was the first thing Mark registered. Not the biting chill of the late autumn air on his skin, but a deep internal cold that had settled in his bones hours ago. It was a cold of finality, of a door being closed and locked for the last time. He stood on the edge of the private dock, the weathered wood groaning softly under his weight, and stared out at the black mirror of Blackwood Lake. The moon was a sliver of bone in the inky sky, offering just enough light to see the ripples his actions had created, now slowly fading into the vast, placid stillness. He had always been a man of meticulous planning. His life was a testament to it. His career in architecture was built on precision, on understanding stress points and load-bearing walls. His marriage, he had once believed, was constructed on the same principles. A foundation of mutual benefit, walls of social propriety, and a roof of shared ambitions. But foundations can crack. And when they do, a controlled demolition is the only logical solution. Clara was gone. The thought wasn't emotional. It was a simple statement of fact, like noting that a project was complete. The argument had been the catalyst, but not the cause. The cause had been 100 small things, 1,000 tiny fractures in the facade of their perfect life. Her recent talk of finding herself, her secret meetings with a divorce lawyer, the way she had started looking at him not with adoration, but with a flicker of fear. Fear was unpredictable. Fear was a variable he couldn't control. And Mark hated variables. He replayed the sequence in his mind, not with remorse, but with the critical eye of an architect reviewing a blueprint. The argument in the kitchen, her voice rising with an uncharacteristic strength, he found irritatingly shrill. The shove, harder than he'd intended, but her fault for being in the way. The sickening crack as her head hit the corner of the granite countertop. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was problematic. It was a mess, but messes could be cleaned. Problems could be solved. He had worked quickly, efficiently. Every action was deliberate. First, the cleanup. Bleach was a beautiful chemical, erasing everything with its sterile, indiscriminate power. He scrubbed the floor, the counter, the small, hidden splatters on the cabinet doors. He was thorough. He had disposed of the bloody towels and the cleaning supplies in a weighted contractor bag, which he'd sunk in the deepest part of the lake an hour ago. Preliminary test. Then there was the matter of Clara. He had wrapped her in the heavy-duty tarpaulin he kept in the garage for landscaping projects. The plastic was thick, impenetrable. He thought of it as her final chrysalis. He had carried her through the house, her weight a dead, cumbersome thing. She had always been complaining about her weight. It was a cruel, fleeting irony that amused him for a second before he dismissed it. The most critical part of the plan was the weight. It had to be enough to hold her down, to resist the natural buoyancy of a decomposing body. He had brought the custom-made concrete blocks from the garage, the ones he'd had poured for anchoring the new floating section of the dock. They were perfect, heavy, untraceable, and readily available. He'd secured them to the wrapped body with heavy-gauge chain and industrial padlocks. There was a grim symmetry to it. He had built this life for them, and now he was using its raw materials to end it. He'd taken the small fishing boat, the one they rarely used, out to the center of the lake. The electric motor was nearly silent, a soft whir that was swallowed by the chirping of the crickets on the shore. He'd found the spot, a deep channel he'd identified on the lake's topographical map months ago during a period of idle, morbid curiosity. He hadn't known then that he would be using the information, but he believed in being prepared. The final act had been surprisingly difficult from a purely physical standpoint. He was strong, but the combined weight was immense. He'd nearly capsized the small boat as he'd rolled his grim cargo over the side. The splash had seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. It was a messy, ugly sound that had violated the lake's tranquility. The body had sunk instantly, a trail of silver bubbles rising to the surface and then vanishing. He'd watched until the water was smooth and black again, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. He'd returned the boat to the dock, wiped it down, and then stood there watching, waiting for the cold inside him to thaw. It hadn't. Now all that was left was the performance. He checked his watch. 2:17 a.m. Time to set the stage. He walked back into the house. The silence was different now. It was no longer the problematic silence of a dead body, but the expectant silence of an empty home. He went to their bedroom. He rummaged through Clara's side of the closet, pulling out a small overnight bag. He put a few of her things inside a nightgown, a book, her toothbrush enough to suggest she had packed in a hurry. He left the bag on the bed. He then went to his office and composed a series of text messages from his own phone to hers. Mark. Clara. Where are you? I woke up and you're gone. Sent at 2:30 a.m. Mark. Is this about our fight? Please come home. We can talk this out. Sent at 2:45 a.m. Mark. I'm getting worried. Your car is still here. Please just answer me. I'm starting to panic. Sent at 3:15 a.m. Her phone lay on the kitchen counter, where he had left it. The screen lit up with each of his messages, each one a carefully crafted brick in the wall of his alibi. He would say they had a fight. She'd stormed out for a walk to cool off and never came back. Her phone and car being at the house would make it all the more confusing, all the more tragic. A distraught woman, upset after a fight, wanders out into the darkness and, what? Slips and falls? Gets lost? The ambiguity was the point. At 4 a.m. he made the call. He took a deep breath, picturing a moment of genuine panic from his pasta-missed flight. A stock market dip and channeled the adrenaline, the frantic edge of anxiety. He dialed 911. 911. What is your emergency? My wife, he said, his voice a carefully modulated tremor of fear. Her name is Clara. We had a fight and she went for a walk and she hasn't come back. I can't find her anywhere. Her car is here, her phone. Oh God. I think something's happened to her. He was brilliant. His performance was flawless. The concern, the rising panic, the hint of self-blame in his voice for their argument was a symphony of feigned distress. Within 20 minutes, the first patrol car arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness and sweeping across the front of their beautiful, custom-designed home. Mark was waiting on the porch, barefoot, wearing only pajamas, the very picture of a man jolted from his sleep into a nightmare. He gave his statement to the uniformed officers, a young man and an older, weary-looking woman. He kept his story simple and consistent. They'd argued about finances, a stupid, meaningless fight. She'd said she needed some air. He'd fallen asleep on the couch, assuming she'd just gone to the guest room. He'd woken up a little while ago and realized she was gone. He had searched the house, the yard, the immediate shoreline. Nothing. The officers were sympathetic. They took his details, asked for a recent photo of Clara, and assured him they would do a more thorough search of the area. As the sun threatened to stain the eastern sky with gray, more cars arrived. The quiet, secluded lakeside lane was suddenly a hub of official activity. A search and rescue team was being assembled. Mark played the part of the grateful, terrified husband perfectly. He offered them coffee. He answered every question with a thoughtful, worried frown. He paced the living room, his gaze repeatedly drifting to the large picture window that overlooked the lake. It was around 5:30 a.m. when the senior detective arrived. Her name was Isabella Rossi. She was a small, sharp-featured woman with intelligent, dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She introduced herself and listened patiently as Mark repeated his story for the third time. Unlike the uniformed officers, she didn't offer words of comfort. She just listened, her expression unreadable. "So, you've searched the grounds yourself, Mr. Peterson?" she asked, her voice calm and even. "Yes, of course," Mark said, running a hand through his hair distractedly. "I walked the whole property line, down to the dock, through the garden. Nothing." "The lake," Detective Rossi said. It wasn't a question. "She was a strong swimmer?" "Yes, very good. She swam every morning in the summer," Mark answered a little too quickly. He knew it was the right answer. If she was a poor swimmer, suspicion would immediately fall on the water. A strong swimmer suggested she would have had no trouble, making a potential drowning less likely to be accidental near the shore. Rossi just nodded, her eyes lingering on the lake for a long moment. "We have teams searching the woods on the other side of the road. But given the proximity, we need to be thorough." She looked directly at Mark, and for the first time, he felt a prickle of genuine unease. Her gaze was too steady, too penetrating. "We're calling in the dive team, just to rule it out." Mark's heart, which had been beating with a steady, controlled rhythm, gave a single hard thud against his ribs. The dive team. It was happening too fast. He had assumed it would be days before they considered such a drastic measure. He had imagined a prolonged search, a gradual fading of hope, a community united in sympathy for the grieving widower. He had not factored in the cold efficiency of this woman. You think she's in the lake?" he stammered, injecting the perfect amount of horror into his voice. "I think we need to be certain she isn't," Rossi corrected him gently, but her eyes were like chips of flint. "It's standard procedure." Mark could only nod, his throat suddenly dry. He watched as Rossi spoke into her radio. The sun was beginning its ascent, but the floodlights they were now erecting by the shoreline cast a harsh, artificial glare, making the impending dawn seem weak and irrelevant. A large van pulled up, and men in thick, black wetsuits began to emerge. He stood by the window, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, and watched them prepare. He watched them strap on tanks and masks. He watched them go over maps of the lake bed with Detective Rossi, who pointed towards the deep channel. His channel. He had been so careful. His plan was perfect. The cleanup was perfect. The alibi was perfect. But a plan is only as strong as its weakest point, and his weakest point was the one thing he could not control. The silent, black water that held his secret. He watched as the first two divers slipped below the surface, their entry a quiet, ominous ripple in the water. The cold inside him intensified, a freezing dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of a carefully constructed world beginning to buckle under an unforeseen pressure. The sun was coming up, but for Mark Peterson, the darkest part of the night was just beginning. The pre-dawn light was a thief, stealing the shadows and revealing the harsh reality of the scene. The tranquil lakeside home had been transformed into an open-air command post. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicles painted macabre, strobing patterns across the manicured lawn. For Mark, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of his living room window. Every quiet conversation between officers, every crackle from a radio, was a potential tremor that could bring his entire world crashing down. He watched the divers' searchlights, two ghostly green beams, moving slowly, methodically, beneath the surface of the lake. They were ghost hunters, he thought with a detached sense of horror, and they were hunting his ghost. He tried to project an aura of anxious hope, of a husband clinging to the desperate possibility that this was all a terrible mistake. But beneath the performance, a cold, pragmatic calculus was running in his head. What were the odds? The lake was vast, over 300 feet deep in the channel. Finding something specific would be like finding a needle in a watery haystack. His plan was still viable. He just needed to hold his nerve. Detective Rossi approached him, her expression unreadable. She held a steaming styrofoam cup. "Coffee," she said, her voice flat. "It's going to be a long morning." "Thank you," Mark murmured, taking the cup. His hand was perfectly steady. He was proud of that. "Tell me about your fight again, Mr. Peterson," Rossi said, her tone conversational, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. "You said it was about finances." "Yes," Mark confirmed. "Clara was. She was a spender. We were trying to save for a new wing on the house, and she just bought a designer handbag that cost a small fortune. It was a stupid thing to argue about, really. I feel terrible about it now." The lie was smooth, practiced. The truth was that Clara had been saving, siphoning money into a private account he'd only discovered last week, an escape fund. And how did it end? The argument, Rossi pressed. She said she needed air. She grabbed her jacket and walked out the back door, towards the lake. I was angry. I just let her go. I fell asleep on the couch. He let his voice trail off, letting her fill in the blanks of his supposed regret. Rossi nodded slowly. "Her jacket is still on the hook by the door, Mr. Peterson. The black peacoat she wears everywhere." Mark's mind raced. It was a small detail, a stupid oversight. He'd been so focused on the major components of the plan, the body, the cleanup, the alibi, that he'd forgotten about the jacket. Maybe she grabbed another one. A sweater. I wasn't really paying attention. I was so angry. "Perhaps," Rossi said, her voice betraying nothing. But Mark saw it. A flicker of something in her eyes. The first seed of official suspicion had been planted. An hour dragged by, then another. The sun was fully up now, its light glinting off the disturbed surface of the lake. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered at the edge of the police tape, their faces a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. Mark felt their eyes on him, and he played his part, pacing, staring at the lake, the picture of a man on the brink of collapse. It was just before 7 a.m. when the radio on Rossi's hip crackled to life. Her posture stiffened as she listened. Mark couldn't hear the words, but he saw the change in her expression. The professional mask tightened, her jaw set. "They've found something," she said, her voice low and devoid of any emotion. She looked at Mark. "We need you to wait inside the house." The words were a hammer blow. He felt the blood drain from his face. He tried to speak, to ask what they had found, but his throat was a knot of dry leather. He could only nod, a jerky, puppet-like motion. He retreated into the house, but he couldn't tear himself away from the window. He watched as the activity on the shore intensified. More officers gathered at the edge of the dock. The divers surfaced, and there was a flurry of motion. Then he saw it. They were using a winch on the back of the SAR truck, its thick cable spooling out into the water. The engine whined with the strain of a heavy load. The surface of the water broke. For a moment, it was just a dark, shapeless mass. Then, the shape resolved into a horrifying form wrapped in black tarpaulin. It was obscene, a monstrous parody of a human figure, dripping with lake water and green fronds of algae. As they hauled it onto the dock, Mark could see the chains and the gray, rectangular shapes of the concrete blocks. His anchors, his perfect, untraceable anchors. He felt a wave of nausea, so powerful it buckled his knees. He stumbled back from the window, collapsing into a chair. It was over. It was all over. His meticulous plan, his controlled demolition, had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had underestimated them. He had underestimated her. The front door opened. Detective Rossi stood there, her face grim. Behind her, a uniformed officer waited. The time for sympathy and gentle questions was gone. "Mark Peterson," she said, her voice hard as iron. "I need you to come with me. We have some questions for you down at the station." The ride to the station was a silent, surreal journey. The world outside the patrol car seemed impossibly normal. People were jogging, walking their dogs, driving to work. They were living in a world where wives didn't end up at the bottom of lakes, and husbands weren't cold-blooded killers. Mark felt a profound, alienating disconnect from it all. The interrogation room was a small, gray box designed to be oppressive. Mark sat at the metal table, the silence pressing in on him. He had asked for a lawyer, a reflexive, defensive move, but he knew it was a futile gesture. They had the body. They had the tarpaulin from his garage. They would match the chains, the locks, the unique concrete blocks he had so foolishly thought were clever. Detective Rossi entered the room with a partner, a large, impassive man who sat in the corner and said nothing. Rossi placed a thin file on the table between them, but didn't open it. "Your wife was planning on leaving you, wasn't she, Mark?" she began, her voice deceptively soft. "We had problems," Mark said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "All marriages do. She had an appointment with a divorce attorney, Catherine Shaw, this Friday?" Rossi continued, ignoring his comment. "We spoke with Ms. Shaw this morning. She said Clara was afraid of you. She said you were controlling, possessive. She said Clara had been documenting your verbal abuse for months." Mark said nothing. He stared at the gray tabletop. "We also spoke with her best friend, Sarah Jensen, a very distraught woman. She told us a funny story. She told us how Clara had called her last week, complaining that you had thrown out her favorite potted olive tree from the patio. Clara was upset because the pot was a custom-made, rectangular concrete planter that her late father had made for her. She said you told her it had cracked and you'd taken it to the dump." Rossi leaned forward, her dark eyes pinning him in place. "The medical examiner just called me, Mark. They've removed the weights. They weren't just concrete blocks. They were pieces of a broken concrete planter, held together with rebar. The me seems to think he can piece them back together. What do you think the chances are they'll match the photos Sarah Jensen just sent us of her best friend's favorite planter?" It was the final, devastating blow. The one detail he could have never anticipated. He had used the planter, smashing it to pieces because its weight and shape were convenient. He had seen it as just another raw material. He had not seen it as a symbol of love, of memory, of connection. He had not understood that it was a part of Clara's story, a story that would refuse to be sunk, that would rise to the surface and pull him down into the darkness with it. He looked up at Detective Rossi, and for the first time, the mask of the grieving husband, of the calm, calculating architect, fell away completely. What was left was something hollow, something cold and empty. He had built his life on a foundation of control, but the one thing he could never control was the truth. And like the body of his wife, the truth had finally been retrieved from the depths. The ripples had reached the shore. The interrogation room had become Mark's entire world. The gray walls, the single, unblinking light overhead, the impassive face of Detective Rossiet was a cell constructed from his own failure. The revelation about the concrete planter had been the wrecking ball that had demolished the last of his defenses. There was no way to explain it, no lie clever enough to cover it. The story had ended. All that was left was the epilogue. He had remained silent for hours, his lawyer by his side, advising him to say nothing. But the silence wasn't a strategy anymore. It was a vacuum, a void where his arrogance and meticulous planning used to be. Rossi would come and go, each time leaving a new piece of evidence on the table like a carefully placed stone, adding more weight to the case against him. First, the preliminary forensics report. Traces of bleach and Clara's blood DNA found in the microscopic grout lines of the kitchen floor, invisible to the naked eye but screamingly obvious to a luminol test. Next, a statement from a neighbor 2 houses down. An insomniac with a telescope, he'd been stargazing around 1:30 a.m. He hadn't seen anything clearly, but he had noted in his log a small, silent electric boat moving out towards the deep channel of the lake, an odd time for a fisherman. Then came the digital evidence. The tech team had broken into Clara's laptop. They found her diary. It was a catalog of her dissolving marriage, detailing Mark's controlling behavior, his coldness, his quiet threats. They found the emails to her sister, where she'd laid out her escape plan, her fear that Mark would go crazy if he found out. The final email, sent the afternoon of her death, read, "I think he knows. The way he looks at me is different. I'm scared. I'm leaving tomorrow no matter what." Each piece of evidence was a nail in his coffin. But it was Rossi's final visit that truly dismantled him. She entered the room alone, without the file, without any new reports. She sat across from him and was quiet for a long time. "I don't get it, Mark," she said finally, her voice softer now, with a note of genuine, weary curiosity. "I've been a detective for 15 years. I've seen crimes of passion, crimes of greed, crimes of pure, psychotic rage. But you don't fit. You're not passionate. The insurance payout is substantial, but you don't seem desperate for money. This was a disposal, an inconvenience you needed to remove." Her words hit him harder than any piece of evidence. She saw him. She saw the cold, empty core of him. He wasn't a grieving husband or a passionate lover. He was an architect, and Clara had become a flaw in his design. "She was leaving me," Mark said, his voice a dry rasp. It was the first thing he had said in hours. His lawyer shot him a sharp look, but he ignored it. The performance was over. "And you couldn't handle that," Rossi stated. "It wasn't about handling it," Mark corrected her, a flicker of his old, pedantic arrogance returning. "It was about the integrity of the structure. Our life, this house, our social standing. It was a project I had designed and built over 2 decades. She was going to take a sledgehammer to it. For what? To find herself? It was illogical. It was an unacceptable demolition. I proposed a solution." Rossi stared at him, a look of profound, horrified understanding on her face. "A solution," she repeated, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "You thought killing your wife was a logical solution." "It was the most efficient solution," Mark said, his voice devoid of emotion. "A messy divorce would have destroyed half of what I'd built. It would have been a public spectacle. My way was clean, contained. The only flaw in the plan was underestimating the sentimentality attached to a block of concrete." He almost smiled, a cold, humorless twitch of his lips. He finally saw the irony. He, the master of materials and structure, had been brought down by the one material he thought he understood best. The confession, when it came, was not a flood of remorse. It was a lecture, a calm, chilling, step-by-step explanation of his project, delivered with the detached air of an architect presenting a blueprint. He detailed the cleanup, the choice of the tarpaulin, the mechanics of sinking the body. He spoke of Clara not as his wife, but as the subject or the variable. He showed no sadness, no anger, no guilt. All he showed was a quiet, intellectual pride in his own meticulousness, and a palpable frustration that it had failed. Listening to him, Rossi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She had been wrong. He wasn't just a cold-blooded killer. He was a monster wearing the perfectly tailored suit of a civilized man. He was a vacuum of empathy, a man who viewed human lives as problems to be solved on a drafting table. Mark Peterson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial was a formality. His taped confession, a masterclass in narcissistic psychopathy, had sealed his fate. The media dubbed him the architect killer. Clara's family and friends mourned her, not just for the life she had lost, but for the life she had been about to reclaim. They held a memorial service by the shores of Blackwood Lake. They threw flowers into the water, vibrant bursts of color that floated on the surface, a stark contrast to the darkness that lay beneath. Detective Rossi attended the service, standing at the back, a silent observer. The case was closed, another file stamped in red and put away in a cabinet. But it would stay with her. She would never look at a beautiful, modern house without wondering about the integrity of its foundation. She would never see the calm, placid surface of a lake without thinking of the secrets it could hold, and the cold-blooded monsters who believed they could bury them forever. Months later, on a warm spring day, Rossi drove out to Blackwood Lake on her day off. The police tape was long gone. A new family was living in the house. Children's laughter echoed from the yard. The lake was a brilliant, sparkling blue under the sun, impossibly beautiful and serene. The water was still, as if it had never been disturbed, as if it held no memory of the cold night when a meticulous husband had tried to make it his accomplice. But Rossi knew better. She knew that the ripples from a single, terrible act never truly fade. They just travel outwards, silently, until they touch every shore.